and that fact. So I oppose the underlying bill and oppose the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
Gentlelady has 3 minutes remaining.
I yield myself the balance remaining of my time.
So ordered.
I hear a lot from my colleagues across the aisle on the experts, but I also wonder how many people in Congress have had to use the national school lunch programs. And frankly, I've been one of those people. So when I hear people speak in opposition to this, saying that it's going to hurt minorities, it's going to hurt those of us who have actually had to use the program, I find it ironic. Frankly, I think that we need more people in office that have had rougher upbringings to bring a different lens and perspective, to hear that whole milk is bad for children, to hear the arguments against organic milk, and to hear the arguments that are coming from across the aisle. I don't know that it represents necessarily the best interest of the American people other than political spite. I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentleman from...
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 118-308. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 118-308, offered by Mr. Mills of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 922, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mills, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment prohibits schools from participating in the school lunch program under the Act from purchasing or offering milk produced by Chinese state-owned enterprises that may be operating here within the United States or elsewhere. As many of us know, in 2008, melamine scandal exposed systemic corruption and disregard for the safety standards within China's own dairy industry. This scandal resulted in the death of 6 infants and sickened thousands more, highlighting the devastating consequences of lax regulations and unethical practices. The evidence is clear. These enterprises pose a serious threat to our consumers' health, our economic security, and our national interests. We can't allow CCP enterprises to export their dangerous practices to our school lunches. This is an issue maintaining American control of critical supply chains that the Chinese state-owned enterprises have no business being in our schools. Florida is one of the largest cattle producers in America, and there's no way I will allow producers in my state to be compromised by the CCP or the PRC. If we fail to act, we risk losing our family farms and jeopardizing the livelihoods of thousands of Americans. This is not about trade isolationism. It's about protecting our children in schools from unsafe products, ensuring fair competition for American producers, and safeguarding our national security. The potential consequences of inaction are simply too great for me to ignore. And the quality and safety of food that we provide to our children is paramount, and we cannot compromise on these standards. We must be vigilant about our source and production practices of the product that we are present in our educational institutions and safeguard them from adversaries who do not share our same interests. By prohibiting schools from purchasing or offering milk produced by China's state-owned enterprises operating in the United States and elsewhere, we aim to send a clear message about our commitment to health and the safety of our children. Last year, over 30 million school children relied on school lunches for their nutrition. We've seen how the CCP has approached other industries, and we cannot allow such an important sector to become vulnerable at a time of crisis. Therefore, I urge you to join me in preventing the CCP-supported entities from infiltrating school lunches and a key American supply chain. This is a necessary step to protect the health and well-being of our citizens, safeguard our economy, and defend our national interests. let us send a clear message that we will prioritize the safety and security of our nation's school children above all else. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman for Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as it may consume. Mr. Chairman, nobody disputes that the dairy industry is a crucial part of domestic supply chains and provides an important economic benefit to the tune of over $753 billion to the U.S. economy. In 2022, just 5 states, California, Wisconsin, Idaho, Texas, and New York, collectively produced more than 50% of the U.S. annual milk supply. School breakfast and school lunch programs are already required to purchase domestic agricultural commodities and food products. Although exemptions exist, milk is produced in sufficient quantities in the U.S. and at competitive prices to severely restrict the ability of any school to purchase foreign-produced milk. To this end, the amendment does not fix the flaws of the underlying bill and makes no meaningful improvements to Buy American policies. We can make sure that Chinese milk is not breaching our supply chain with continued monitoring and enforcement of present law. The recent report found that Chinese seafood has been served in schools, highlighting the need for additional diligence in enforcing present law. I don't support the underlying legislation, and I oppose the amendment as being unnecessary and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman is recognized from Florida.
Well, it's interesting, and I understand that facts, for whatever reason, seem to sink in a lot slower on the left than they do in America's party. So I'll say this once more. In 2008, melamine scandal exposed systemic corruption and disregard for complete safety by milk that was produced by the dairy products of China. So it's interesting that you say that they aren't actually weakening anything when they had infants and children to the thousands who had died and were sick by their actual produce capabilities or incapabilities and capacity. So again, facts are a very finical thing. They are oftentimes slowly leaked in on the left. But you can't dispute that China's production of dairy has been less safe and less put under the regulations and rigorous streams that they do in American production under the FDA. With that, I go ahead and yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, does the gentleman yield back his time?
Gentleman yield back.
Okay. Thank you. I yield myself the balance of the time. Just to reiterate that present law requires domestic purchase, and so this is unnecessary. And if Chinese milk has gotten into the supply, we need to monitor that. It violates present law. And to suggest that we're ignoring science, the underlying bill is ignore science. That's the purpose of the underlying bill. So I would hope that we would reject the amendment and reject the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 118-308. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 118-308, offered by Mr. Tiffany of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 922, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
My bipartisan amendment prevents the USDA from issuing any rule that bans any of the milk covered in this bill, including chocolate milk. This would ensure that all types and flavors of milk are available to school children and not subject to bureaucratic rulemaking. Some may ask, why are we focusing on this issue? Unfortunately, it's because the USDA has its sights on getting rid of chocolate milk in schools. It's now up to us to act. This summer, it was reported that the Department of Agriculture is considering a ban on chocolate milk in elementary and middle schools. USDA issued a proposed rule that would set a new nutrition standard for school meals. These new standards could limit the availability of flavored milk like chocolate and strawberry in high schools, while children in elementary and middle schools would have no access at all. For those of you with young children or grandchildren, go and ask them what they think about USDA's new rule. I think I can speak for most folks when saying that when I was young, chocolate milk was usually the highlight of having lunch at school. But this new rule would mean that roughly 30 million students who participate in the USDA's school meal programs would no longer be able to have chocolate milk or any flavored milk for that matter. According to the Journal of the American Dietetic Association, removing flavored milk from schools resulted in a 62 to 63% reduction in milk consumption by kids in kindergarten through 5th grade, including a 50% reduction in 6th through 8th grades. Milk is full of rich nutrients that support bone growth and development, and millions of children enjoy drinking it. We should not allow rules that would limit our children's access to delicious and nutritious products like milk and its varieties covered in this great bill. Come and take it, USDA. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bipartisan amendment.
Gentleman reserves?
I reserve.
For what purposes from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, current law requires that school meals and beverages offered under the school meal programs be consistent with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the DGAs, which are drafted by an advisory committee of experts. These are evidence-based recommendations set to provide nutritional guidance to ensure children receive the most nutritious meals possible. This amendment would effectively undermine the unbiased, evidence-based guidelines of the DGAs by prohibiting USDA from doing its work and replacing that process with a process where evidence will be presented to politicians and we get to decide the science. It is critical that actual scientists and experts make the recommendations and guide the process in determining options in schools, and the regulations that are updated to align with current DGAs. Experts, not members of Congress, should be the ones determining the nutrition standards to ensure that our children get the healthiest meals possible. This amendment, like the underlying bill, reinforces the precedent for Congress to legislate on specific foods at the behest of one industry or another that would be served in schools. There is a reason that the school lunch program does not contain specific nutrition standards for foods and beverages, and that is to ensure that nutrition standards can adapt to the latest science and expert recommendations. Both this amendment and the underlying bill upset this policy and opened the program to politicization in favor of district interests and single food lobbies over the health and well-being of our children. The dozens of organizations, including the American Nutrition, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Heart Association, and a lot of others have urged Congress not to interfere with that process and to respect the science-based process. For these reasons, I urge a no vote on the amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, those experts, they've done us so well in the United States of America. Why are we $33 trillion in debt? Why do we have childhood obesity that is off the charts at this point? Oh, those experts serve us so well. Those experts that told us that butter is not good for us. Remember that a number of decades ago? Growing up on a dairy farm in western Wisconsin, I couldn't believe that they were telling us, the experts, that butter is not good for us. Well, all of a sudden, they're changing their tune on that. They told us that whole milk, we shouldn't possibly drink that. They're beginning to turn on that also and saying maybe that is good for our children. Yeah, the experts, they have done us so well. The reason I bring this before the House of Representatives is I did listen to experts. Those people that run the school lunch programs. I will never forget a day about a decade ago when I stopped at a local gas station in northern Wisconsin, and a school lunch director came up to me. I didn't even know her. She said, at that time, Senator Tiffany, she said, would you tell the federal government to get out of our school lunch program? We are throwing away so much food. That was, remember, Michelle Obama's school lunch dictates that she put in place, and the school lunch director said, don't do that to us. I had multiple school lunch directors across northern Wisconsin in my district say, federal government, stay out of our school lunch programs. We know what we're doing, we're trained in what we're doing, and we see what happens in our schools. This amendment should be passed, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of the time. And ask unanimous consent to enter a letter signed by dozens of organizations opposing this changing the science and the process. This amendment would make it impossible to update the science based on new evidence. We should be basing our decisions based on science, not what somebody tells us at the gas station. I would hope that we would defeat the amendment and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's request will be covered by general leave. Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. There being no further amendments under the rule, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union has had under consideration H.R. 1147, and pursuant to House Resolution 922, I report the bill as amended by that resolution back to the House with sundry further amendments adopted in the Committee of the Whole.
The chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 1147 and pursuant to House Resolution 922, reports the bill as amended by that resolution back to the House with sundry further amendments adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. In a separate vote demanded on any amendment reported from the committee is a separate vote demanded on any amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole. If not, the chair will put them in gross. The question is on the adoption of the amendments. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. The amendments are agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act to allow schools that participate in the school lunch program under such act to serve whole milk.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes still have it.
Request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or votes objected to under Clause 6 of Rule 20. The House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and agree to the resolution H-Res 927.
The clerk, title of the resolution.
House Resolution 927, resolution condemning anti-Semitism on university campuses and the testimony of university presidents in the House Committee on Education and the Workforce.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H-Res 927.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
So ordered.
It depends on the context. This was the testimony delivered by so-called prestigious university presidents when presented with the question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your campus bullying and harassment policies? The context. What a disgraceful legalistic answer from academia's supposed top minds. As chairwoman of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, I'll tell you what never depends on the context. Defending the rights of Jewish students to feel safe on campus. Condemning calls to incite violence against the world's most persecuted ethnic group is always appropriate and never depends on the context. And holding smug university elites accountable never depends on the context. That's why I rise today in support of this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose is the gentleman is recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield myself such time as I may consume.
So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I condemn anti-Semitism in all forms. Moreover, calls for genocide of Jewish people has no place in reasonable discourse, and I condemn that too. I don't think such a statement would be necessary, but in today's context, it is necessary. These sentiments were shared repeatedly by Claudine Gay of Harvard, Sally Kornbluth from MIT, and Elizabeth McGill from the University of Pennsylvania during their testimony last week. Unfortunately, because of the 5-minute exchange towards the end of the hearing that was clipped and shared online without full context during the hours-long hearing, these university presidents' commitment to fighting anti-Semitism has been called into question. This is because during the clip, they answered the question asked. They made the mistake of believing the hearing was a serious attempt to ascertain what could be done to promote student safety on campus in light of the tension between the First Amendment protections of freedom of speech on the one hand and the Criminal Code, Title VI, and Campus Code of Conduct on the other. Some speech, such as threats, can be so severe as to be criminal. Other speech could establish a hostile environment on campus in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Universities can establish codes of conduct prohibiting some speech while respecting the First Amendment. But any speech involved in the First Amendment analysis is likely to be reprehensible. The fact that it might be protected does not make the speech any less reprehensible and does not suggest that you even agree with it. A call for genocide of Jewish people is obviously reprehensible in all contexts, but whether or not it is constitutionally protected depends on context. Don't take my word for it. Read the article published recently in the Harvard Crimson, authored by Harvard law professor Charles Fried, formerly Solicitor General during the Reagan administration. In the article, Professor Fried states, and I quote, "When asked whether they would discipline students, or I suppose faculty, if they called for genocide of Jews, each president responded that the answer depends on the context of the utterance." He goes on by saying, "I've taught at Harvard Law School since 1961 and began practicing before the Supreme Court in 1985, 4 years as Solicitor General of the United States, and I would have felt professionally obligated to answer as the presidents did. It does depend on context." In the 1969 Brandenburg v. Ohio Supreme Court ruled unanimously the Constitution guarantees free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid or prescribe advocacy of the use of force or law violation, except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to incite or promote such action. He continues that speech itself indeed is well protected. The three university presidents head private institutions that are not bound by every aspect of the federal constitutional restraints, but each institution in various ways has declared itself committed to protecting the First Amendment values over the years. So it is not surprising that their presidents would have answered that whether they would discipline or expel students for advocating genocide depends on the context. If one seeks to follow constitutional principles, answering this question certainly does depend on context. That's what Professor Fried said. That is the kind of analysis applied to any freedom of speech question. It's even being applied to former President Trump today. Was his speech on January 6, 2021, a crime of inciting violence, or was it protected speech? Incredibly, the university presidents were directed to give a one-word answer, yes or no, and they responded, as Professor Fried said he would have been professionally obligated to do, it depends on context. Regrettably, they took the question as an opportunity to seriously discuss the constitutional implications of a complex question. That was a big mistake. And for that mistake, we are considering a resolution to condemn them and ask them to resign. I also think it's important to put this resolution in context, because in 2017, after white supremacists walked through the campus of University of Virginia shouting, "Jews will not replace us," Democrats on the committee requested a hearing on that incident, and nothing happened. Meanwhile, the one who declared there were good people on both sides has been enthusiastically endorsed. We need to do everything the law allows to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination on college campuses. This resolution is not a serious effort to advance that cause. I therefore oppose this resolution and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Conference Chairwoman, Ms. Stefanik.
Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairwoman Fox for chairing last week's important hearing. There is a reason that last week's hearing, the university presidents of Harvard, Penn, and MIT made history as the most watched congressional testimony in history with over 1 billion views. And that's because their testimony was the most morally bankrupt testimony in the history of the United States Congress. When asked the very specific question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate your code of conduct on bullying and harassment, the world watched and the world heard their answers in horror. As the president of Harvard, the president, now former of Penn, and the president of MIT equivocated, dehumanized, and failed to answer yes. Anyone with a sliver of decency, humanity, and morality knows that the answer to that question is yes. President Kornbluth of MIT said that such depravity would only be considered harassment depending on the, quote, context. When pressed during her questioning, Penn's President, now former President McGill's response was shocking to the extreme. Quote, if the speech becomes conduct, it can be harassment. Finally, Harvard President Gay, whose answer was the same, quote, it depends on the context. It was pathetic, amoral, and inhumane, and by God, the world heard it. And as I said in the hearing, it does not depend on the context. As attacks against Jewish students have skyrocketed on campuses across America, we clearly have tremendous work ahead of us, Mr. Speaker, to address this rot of anti-Semitism that is now rooted in our once premier higher education institutions. And we will not be deterred by this important work. This is why I rise today in support of my bipartisan resolution condemning the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses around the country and the morally bankrupt testimony of those university presidents.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
I give the gentlewoman another 30 seconds.
It is only a first step, but it is an important step. I commend my colleagues, Congressman Moskowitz, Majority Leader Scalise, and Congressman Gottheimer for joining to lead this historically important bipartisan effort to stand for moral truth. And I yield back the balance to the chairwoman.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Ranking Member Scott, for recognizing me. Mr. Speaker, as someone who has dedicated most of her career to combating anti-Semitism and as the co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I know well that anti-Semitism has been on the rise in our country for years. It was a growing problem before the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack, and sadly, immediately after that savage attack, anti-Semitism has skyrocketed, particularly on college campuses. What we have seen happening on college campuses is outrageous, and too many college and university leaders have totally failed in their moral responsibility to condemn anti-Semitism. They have failed to keep Jewish students and faculty members safe. That is shameful. And yes, I was appalled by the failure of the 3 college presidents to simply say yes. A call for the genocide of Jews is wrong, period. But I have no interest in meaningless resolutions that do nothing to address the underlying issue of anti-Semitism. That's why my colleagues should join us in crafting serious bipartisan legislation that will make a real difference. We don't need throwaway resolutions. We need effective solutions. If we're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, we need legislation to implement and codify the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. We need to pass the President's request for $200 million in emergency supplemental funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We need to fully fund the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, not to cut that funding. And we need to strengthen our federal civil rights laws to punish all universities that fail to protect Jewish students. Until we do that, non-binding, politically motivated resolutions are not worth the paper they're written on. When anti-Semitism rears its ugly head, it harms us all, and it eats at the foundations of our democracy. I have always called out anti-Semitism on the left and on the right, and I will continue to do so. But I don't want just words. I want this Congress to take action and pass implementing legislation. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Virginia reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Joe Wilson.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, a former college president yourself, who understands these issues. And I'm very grateful for Republican Conference Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, who is courageously leading this resolution that condemns anti-Semitism on university campuses. Most Americans are shocked at the insane campus anti-Semitism that has developed, and I reviewed this in a lead op-ed in the Washington Times, December the 7th. My analysis was, sadly, college campuses have descended from coveted citadels of intellectual freedom to illiberal sewers of intolerance and bigotry. Diversity and inclusion are a George Orwell 1984 implementation, excluding conservative thought. Over the years, as infantile leftists hire only other infantile leftists, the most extreme even hire more extreme as each tries to do the other in leftism. This leads to today's suicidal derangements, even as the regime in Tehran, coordinating with war criminal Putin, develops missiles for a nuclear attack on the big Satan, America, which would vaporize college campuses. The solution for closed-minded intolerance on campuses is obvious. To liberate academia from denial of free speech, there should be the inclusion and diversity of more conservative academics overcoming today's blatant discrimination. All Americans in good faith want college education to be uplifting for students to achieve the American dream, and I look forward to working with my colleague, Congresswoman Manning. This should be bipartisan. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you. Like most Americans, I happen to be in the room because I'm on the committee and was a little bit startled and stunned by the lack of concern for rampant anti-Semitism on the most prominent universities in this country, the leaders who were chosen to lead those universities. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it happening on our premier campuses? You know, I can go in Wisconsin, all the hard workers in the factories, all the hard workers on the farms, all the people working in retail. I don't see any evidence of this. As a matter of fact, I don't think there's anywhere in the state of Wisconsin I'd go and find this sort of thing. But nevertheless, we seem to be finding it on our universities. And the question is, why is that so? And is there anything out there would give an indication that you have a possibility of anti-Semitism? Part of it, I think, is coming from recent immigrants who are carrying grievances from long ago to the United States. But the more concerning one is the spoiled upper middle classes that make up so many of the college students and the professors that make up the college students. And I think what we're coming out of is what I'll call the bored upper middle classes looking for something to do, and the unhappiness out of that boredom that leads them to be anti-American, but also anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, because when they see Palestine, the Gaza and Israel, they see one successful Western country and they see an unsuccessful, crooked country, and it leads them to be so mentally muddled up that they can't see what's wrong with the horrific murders that took place. So in any event, I condemn this. Thank you.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve. I have an additional speaker coming, but he's not here yet.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from California, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Kiley.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
For nearly 4 centuries, Harvard has been known for many great things. As America's first college, as the alma mater of 8 presidents, as the most fertile of ground for new ideas and cutting-edge research. Yet now, in this moment, Harvard has become known for a truly terrible thing: for anti-Semitism, for leading a 21st century American resurgence of one of the world's most ancient and retrograde prejudices. And this is in large part because of the words and action as well as the silence and inaction of President Claudine Gay. We have all now seen the shocking testimony from last week, but to borrow a phrase from Dr. Gay, we need to also look at the context of Harvard having the very worst ranking in the entire country for protecting free speech, the context of President Gay initially refusing to condemn the Hamas terrorist attack and then refusing to condemn the student groups that blamed Israel, the context of Harvard's woefully inadequate measures to protect Jewish students both before October 7th, but especially after, to the point that at the hearing, President Gay would refuse to even answer the question as to whether a Jewish student can feel safe and welcome on her campus. That Harvard has declined to remove President Gay even after Penn forced out its president speaks volumes about the singular failures of that university. Yet Harvard also offers a broader window into what ails higher education in our country. This is a moment of reckoning for American higher education. Our universities cost too much, deliver too little value to graduates, and have become the most intolerant places in American life. Now is the time for fundamental change to reform the American university, and this resolution is a first step. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Chairman of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee, Mr. Bean.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Speaker, we have seen the evil and hatred of anti-Semitism find its voice across American college and university campuses, and we have seen the full force of Jewish hatred grow as student organizations continue to celebrate the horrific October 7th terrorist attacks. These institutions have become hate factories that are quick to allow the spread of anti-Semitism, but slow to condemn it, if at all. Harvard President Claudine Gay even said calling for the genocide of Jewish students depends on the context when it comes to violating the university's code of conduct. Let me be clear. Today, the faces of modern anti-Semitism in American education are Harvard, UPenn, MIT. These institutions have gone from elite to elitist. At Harvard, if you use the wrong pronouns, that's a violation of their code of conduct. But violently targeting Jewish students and calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, that's acceptable Harvard conduct. The history of the Holocaust reminds us what will happen when hatred is met by silence. We cannot stand by while students feel threatened. It's more than a discussion, Mr. Speaker. It's a call to action, and that's why I'm proud to support Representative Stefanik's resolution condemning anti-Semitism in institutions of higher learning and specifically condemning Presidents McGill, Gay, and Kornbluth for failing to denounce the calls for genocide on their campuses. 17 times it was asked, 17 times they failed the question. Mr. Speaker, it bears repeating, anti-Semitism is not activism. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of HRES 927. Last week, America watched in bewilderment as the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn were unable to say if calls for a genocide of Jews violated their harassment and bullying policy. Let's not forget campus leaders go after microaggressions, but suddenly, when it comes to anti-Semitism, they chose to remain silent. At that same hearing, I asked Harvard's president how she could rectify cracking down on faculty for saying there are biologically two genders, but maintain that calling for genocide is protected speech. The reality is, at these universities, free speech only applies to certain people at certain times, which is why these schools rank at the bottom of scorecards that judge freedom of speech. The inability of these presidents to condemn anti-Semitic rhetoric only encourages further harassment and jeopardizes the safety of Jewish students and ultimately all. They need to be held to account. I encourage adoption of the resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman for Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, could I inquire as to how much time is remaining?
Gentlewoman has 8.5 minutes remaining.
And Mr. Scott?
Gentleman from Virginia has 11.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, anti-Semitism on college campuses incident tracking from 2019 to 2023. 659 total reported anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses since October 7, a 700% increase compared to last year. This was updated on December 13th, 2023. Since the terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish students on college campuses have reached alarmingly high rates, increasing by 700% over the same period last year. Hillel International has been working around the clock with our partners to report with their partners to address these incidents and to ensure that all Jewish students feel safe on campus. This is coming from a report from Hillel, which I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a member of the Committee on Education and the Workforce, Mr. Williams.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank Representative Stefanik, my colleague from New York, for introducing this much-needed resolution. With issues as critical as mitigating anti-Semitism and protecting our Jewish community, it is vital that we speak today with moral clarity. Just days ago, in a hearing in the House Education and Workforce Committee, we heard shocking testimony from the presidents of what were once our most esteemed educational institutions. Each one of these institutions have more than 100 years of history educating our youth. One, Harvard University, is closing in on 400 years of history. These schools have an embarrassment of riches, billions of dollars in annual revenue, much of it from federal funds, billions more in endowments, no, tens of billions of dollars in endowments. They have the resources to reach any educational goal. When pressed on the solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, each of them testified that education was, in fact, the solution. Education is supposed to be the solution to anti-Semitism. Yet with all of that history, with all of those resources, with the esteem of our society and the world, these universities are ground zero for rampant, virulent, obscene, and inhuman anti-Semitism. The hearings last week exposed not only the lack of moral leadership at these schools, it exposed a sickness in the culture of our elite universities. If calling for the murder and genocide of fellow students for the crime of being Jewish is not immediately and completely repugnant, then there is no moral compass at the heart of these institutions. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to oppose this resolution, which, to my knowledge, would mark the first time in American history that the House of Representatives would vote to tell private college and university presidents to resign. I want all of my colleagues to think very seriously about what this means for us today and in the future. We're all profoundly disturbed by the resurgence of anti-Semitism and racism in campus towns, including death threats, serious death threats against Jewish students at Cornell, and actual shootings and attempted murder of 3 Palestinian American students in Burlington, Vermont. We all want to express our outrage in House resolutions, which we've done more than 20 times as a House of Representatives, and numerous times even since October 7th. For example, on November 2nd, we passed House Resolution 798, which condemned all forms of anti-Semitism on college campuses, denounced any support for terrorist groups on campus, reaffirmed the free speech rights of Jewish students and faculty, and urged enforcement of federal civil rights laws to protect Jewish students against anti-Semitism. So why do we need this resolution? Well, the only thing new about it is that it would have the U.S. House of Representatives call specifically for the resignation of 2 college presidents, a call that has been slipped in at the bottom of page 2 of the resolution. This extraordinary passage comes close to being what the Constitution calls a bill of attainder, which is the unconstitutional imposition by Congress on a specific citizen or citizens of a criminal punishment or stigma by the Congress itself. Although this resolution is not a criminal punishment or stigma against specific citizens, it is undoubtedly a civil punishment and stigma against specific American citizens. How many of you would like the president of the college where you went or where your children go to be walking around with a congressional resolution telling them to resign? Everyone knows that this will be an academic scarlet letter and a professional death sentence for anyone carrying it around. Does anyone think that UPenn's President Liz McGill, who's already resigned in the face of Ms. Stefanik's ceaseless campaign to force her out, will ever be able to find another college presidency? Give me a break. Now, I hold no brief for the college president's overly legalistic, ethically tone-deaf answers awkwardly advanced in response to Ms. Stefanik's rapid-fire yes-no questions. It should not be difficult for anybody to say that in the age of rampant gun violence and lax Republican gun laws, which have put tens of millions of AR-15s into circulation in our society, anyone calling for genocide of the Jews or anyone else should be sent immediately a campus security detail to see if they pose the risk of harm to other people or if they need an immediate mental health exam. And if there's not an imminent threat, surely the call for genocide of the Jews by definition constitutes a hostile learning environment and should occasion aggressive disciplinary action. So where was the common sense on the part of the college presidents? But where is the common sense in the Congress of the United States of America? Calling for the resignation of private individuals at private universities would be a dramatic and unprecedented departure for the U.S. Congress, which has never before voted to tell a college president to resign. Before we affix this lifelong stigma, reproach, and dishonor on a private citizen, do you think perhaps we should offer them some kind of due process? The kind of due process that even George Santos got and that Donald Trump is getting all over America right now for his 91 federal and state felony charges? I request 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Should Harvard President Claudine Gay, who is the first Haitian American ever to serve in that position, and Sally Kornbluth, who is Jewish, get the chance to explain what they are actually doing to combat racism and anti-Semitism at their schools and what they have done in their lives and in their careers to oppose anti-Semitism and racism, which are the gateway to destruction of liberal democracy? Do we care about that? Or is this just a bunch of drive-by talking points? Is it relevant that the Harvard and MIT boards have made unanimous statements affirming the leadership of their two college presidents? Are we saying that their boards don't matter or they are indifferent to anti-Semitism? And the leaders of the Freedom Caucus know better than the Jewish president of MIT what anti-Semitism is? Now, I know these two were the presidents testifying before Ms. Stefanik, but are we sure that these two are even the worst in the country when it comes to bias and discrimination? Is this a one-shot deal, or, as Ms. Stefanik promises, is this just the beginning? Are we going to go through all the college and university presidents in America? And what about the CEOs of the businesses? Maybe they are not performing to her satisfaction either. And indeed, maybe there are college presidents who've looked the other way in not hypothetical cases of anti-Semitism and racism, but real cases of anti-Semitism and racism. What about them? Are we going to let them go, or are we going to go after them? Maybe we should determine who the worst are before we start using the resources of the House of Representatives to call for people to resign. Are there college presidents, by the way, who looked the other way when there was sexual abuse of college male wrestling team members, rape of students, or female gymnasts, or female soccer players? Are we interested in that now that we are superintending higher education in America? Now that we are the appellate review board for the colleges?
Has expired.
I'd like to request one more minute.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman is recognized.
Additional 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, are we prepared to become the National Academic Appeals Panel for college presidents, coaches, and professors? Or is that perhaps best left to the universities themselves? Maybe it's that we just don't have a positive legislative agenda of our own to lower drug prices in America, to get aid to our democratic allies in Ukraine against fascist imperialist thug Vladimir Putin. Maybe we don't have anything real to do, so we decide instead to go around and start lecturing to college presidents and college boards all over America. In the absence of a real program for America, the majority is filling our hours with censures, expulsions, motions to vacate the speakership, overthrow their own leaders, and of course impeachment of President Biden. For what? For doing nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. That's all that they give us. And this cannibalistic instinct they've unleashed now turns on private citizens, academic leaders who will wear the scarlet letter A so they can have some more press conferences. I'm voting no on this resolution. I yield back and thank the chair.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
I am prepared to close too, and I believe the gentleman will close first.
Gentleman reserves.
How much time do I have left?
Gentleman has 4.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous
Gentlelady from North Carolina has 6 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a group invited by the majority in 2018 to testify at a hearing examining the First Amendment rights on campus, and a group that authors the free speech ranking the majority cited several times at the committee hearing. I want to enter into the record a statement from December 8th entitled, "University Presidents Were Right to Condemn Hate Speech and Defend Free Speech."
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the letter, the statement goes that Gay was indeed correct on the calls for genocide Jews were personally abhorrent and at odds with the values at Harvard. She is also correct that Harvard gives wide berth to free expression, even to views that are objectionable, and takes action when free speech crosses into conduct that violates our policies. Apparently, her sin was trying to explain freedom of speech to Congress and the American people. Supreme Court and federal law makes clear that speech in educational settings constitute harassment sufficient to result in expulsion or other discipline. It must be so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it effectively bars the victim's access to the educational opportunity. Had Stefanik and her colleagues taken time to familiarize themselves with the current law on free speech and frame their questions in terms of legal definition of harassment, they would have found common agreement with all three presidents. Mr. President, I condemn anti-Semitism. I condemn calls for genocide of Jewish people. I guess in this context that has to be repeated over and over again. I'm also concerned about the polarization of college campuses and the disturbing rise of discrimination and incidents on college campuses. And as I've noted, I'm skeptical of the majority's newfound concerns about anti-Semitism on college campuses because, as I said in 2017, after white supremacists marched through the University of Virginia grounds shouting, "Jews will not replace us," I do not recall the same level of outrage. In fact, I note that the endorsement of the one who declared that there were good people on both sides. I wrote a letter to the majority requesting a congressional hearing at that time, and our calls went unanswered. Mr. Speaker, I concede that the university president's testimony last week, when taken out of context, fell into the First Amendment trap that when you suggest that freedom, that speech is protected, therefore you must agree with it. No. You can believe that speech is protected, but also believe that it is reprehensible. And calling for genocide of Jews is reprehensible in all contexts, but it could also be protected. Mr. Speaker, they answered the question the way Professor Fried said that he would have been professionally obligated to respond, but answering the question as posed should not warrant calls for his resignation. We need to do everything we can do under the law to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination. This resolution fails to do anything to establish standards that can address reprehensible divisions in our society and on college campuses. So I oppose this resolution and urge my colleagues to also vote no. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm disappointed that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle think that Republicans need a lecture on free speech or freedom of religion. We do not need such a lecture on that, and we understand those concepts. Those are our first freedoms, and we are very keenly aware of those. Mr. Speaker, there are massive problems in post-secondary education in our country, and our committee is doing its best to address some of those problems and to do something about them. What we know, what we knew before the hearing, and what we know even more strongly after the hearing that we held last week is that Jewish students are facing a massive rise in violence on our college and university campuses. According to the Anti-Defamation League and Hillel International, 73% of Jewish students surveyed said they experienced anti-Semitism on campus this year. That number is up from 32% in 2021. Yes, yet college administrators, like the ones who testified before the committee last week, are not acting to protect students. Now's not the time for campus leaders to sit on their hands. The only way to salvage American academia and restore a safe learning environment for its students is by rooting out anti-Semitism and standing up against hate. I thank God that the Committee on Education and the Workforce is up to the task. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 927? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, 2/3 being the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I requested yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2365 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2365, a bill to direct the Secretary of Health and Human Services to carry out a national project to prevent and cure Parkinson's, to be known as the National Parkinson's Project, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials in the record on the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate it. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 2365, the newly titled Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. And I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. First, I want to thank Chairman Rogers for her support of this bill and passing it out of markup last week unanimously by a vote of 47-0. I'm also grateful to my good friend and colleague on this bill, the co-lead Representative Paul Tonko, for his support and for working with me on this particular piece of legislation. Mr. Tonko has been a true partner in this effort to provide hope for patients living with Parkinson's disease, and I commend him for his advocacy on behalf of the community. In that spirit, Mr. Speaker, the Michael J. Fox Foundation has been a champion for this mission to fund research for better treatments and cures for over 23 years. Michael J. Fox has been able to use his own diagnosis and celebrity status to channel into over $1 billion for translational research. We have a letter of endorsement from his foundation and 30 other Parkinson's neurological advocacy groups and organizations, and I truly could not thank them enough for their support and grassroots efforts on this particular bill. H.R. 2365 is no-cost legislation. Again, I want to repeat, no-cost legislation that will unite experts from government and the private sector to develop a national Parkinson's project with the goal of preventing, treating, and ultimately curing Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's affects almost 1 million Americans nationwide, and it is the fastest growing neurological disease with no cure available, unfortunately. It costs our healthcare system over $52 billion annually, and that number is projected to increase over the next decade to $80 billion. We must do all we can to change that trajectory. Sadly, many of my close family members, Mr. Speaker, are among those who have been diagnosed with this horrific disease. This year in particular has been very difficult for my family as I lost my brother, Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis, to Parkinson's disease in May. As a primary care physician, my brother cared for his community and his family. He really did, and I'm so thankful that my friend and colleague, Anna Eshu, she's a godsend, suggested we rename the title of the bill after him in his honor, and for her strong support on this bill. My brother was an outstanding individual, in my opinion, a saint, and may his memory be eternal. Further, my mother-in-law, Theodora Dialios, also passed away just this past October after a years-long battle with the disease. She was a strong and wonderful woman. My uncle also had a diagnosis and passed away a few years ago, and my father, Congressman Mike Bilirakis, who was chairman of the Health Subcommittee under Energy and Commerce, Peter worked with him. He was diagnosed just recently. So this is for you, Dad, as well, and all of my constituents. Given these personal connections, I have made it a mission to enact legislation that will help Parkinson's patients around the country. And H.R. 2365 is the first step in that direction. Thankfully, we have been able to come together in a bipartisan fashion to move this bill forward, and I'm hopeful we will get broad bipartisan support in the House today, Mr. Speaker. This could also not come at a more critical time, as earlier this year, researchers were able to newly discover a Parkinson's biomarker that will help reveal pathologies and provide better understanding in research and development efforts. I truly believe we are on the brink of new breakthroughs for treatments and cures, and that one day we will completely eradicate this dreadful disease. But we must be proactive, and we can't afford, none of us can afford to wait any longer. This National Parkinson's Project will provide an integrated strategy to support and coordinate research efforts, collaborate to prevent duplication, encourage development of safe and effective treatments, and review the impact on patients and their caregivers and families. With passage of this bill, Mr. Speaker, HHS will be tasked with the creation of a new advisory council comprising of experts in the field across the federal government and every related agency, combined with non-federal, this is how you do it, public-private partnership, non-federal appointed members represented by the patient advocates, specialist providers, clinicians, and researchers working in the Parkinson's space. This advisory council will focus its efforts on an annual report to the Secretary and to Congress with an evaluation on the current efforts to prevent, treat, and cure Parkinson's once and for all. It will also provide recommendations for ways to reduce the escalating burden of this disease on patients and families, the caregivers, Mr. Speaker, including ways to reduce costs, improve health outcomes, and quality of care for Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries and our nation's true American heroes, our veterans, and better research, again, researching the underlying causes of this terrible disease. Lastly, H.R. 2365 will incorporate other neurodegenerative Parkinson's-related diseases, including the rare disease progressive supranuclear palsy, PSP. PSP is an extremely aggressive disease that progresses rapidly with life expectancy of 6 to 9 years after diagnosis and has no known cure or cause. But like Parkinson's, we can change that if we act now. I was so saddened to learn that our friend and House colleague, Jennifer Wexton, was diagnosed with PSP. Our thoughts and prayers are with her and her family, and her bravery is to be commended for continuing in Congress on behalf of her constituents by battling this horrific disease. She did so much. Again, Mr. Speaker, I thank her, Representative Wexton, for her support. I couldn't do it without her. Bipartisan support. Again, Representative Wexton for her support on this effort, and we are absolutely honored to be able to add her name to the title of this legislation as well. In the end, there has never been a better time to move forward with H.R. 2365, the Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. I want to thank my good friend and Majority Leader Steve Scalise for helping put this bill on the suspension calendar this week. We really appreciate it. Accelerating the process. It's a no-brainer. We've got to cure this disease as soon as possible, save lives, and again, quality of life is so very important as well. Let's do the right thing for the Parkinson's community by getting this bill through the House floor to the Senate and enacted into law as soon as possible. Thank you so very much. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2365, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise today in support of the Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. These past few years, I have been honored to champion this legislation on behalf of the more than 1 million Americans living with Parkinson's. I first learned more in depth about Parkinson's from a friend who suffered with the disease. So when the opportunity arose to partner with Congressman Bilirakis on this meaningful effort, I jumped right in and made it my personal mission to get this done on behalf of the millions of people living with Parkinson's. As you may know, currently there are no treatments to cure, prevent, or significantly slow down its progression. Parkinson's is the second most common neurological disease and is unfortunately growing, and growing fast. I do want to highlight that there is hope on the horizon. Earlier this year, researchers discovered a new biomarker for Parkinson's disease. This is an exciting step forward, but much more research and coordination is needed. Our bipartisan, no-cost legislation will, for the first time, unite our federal government in a mission to cure and prevent Parkinson's, alleviate financial and health burdens on American families, and reduce government spending over time. This pioneering legislation is greatly needed. This bill will bring federal stakeholders and non-federal experts together to implement a national plan to prevent and cure the disease, improve diagnoses and treatment options, and lessen the burden for caregivers and their families. The bill text is modeled off the successful National Alzheimer's Project model, which brought together many parts of our federal government to improve the federal response. Once signed into law, this bill will do for Parkinson's what the national plan did for Alzheimer's, and bring together coordination, care, and research, all to help those with Parkinson's as well as their loved ones. This would help bring a strong focus to a cure, a treatment, and also prevention. It will shine a needed light on the suffering related to Parkinson's. Sadly, we recognize that environmental triggers are likely a part of Parkinson's, but so much still is unknown. More research and more coordination are critical to getting answers to these questions. I thank the Michael J. Fox Foundation for everything that it does, but especially all of the work that they provided on behalf of this bill. And thank you to the New York-based groups and advocates who stood by my side demanding action on this bill and giving a face to Parkinson's, and that mission and their journey was over a series of years. Together with patients, with families, and with medical professionals, we learned about the challenges of Parkinson's and why this bill is so desperately, urgently needed. Thank you to my good friend, Gus Bilirakis. Thank you, Gus, for working on the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act with me. It's an honor to work with you on this, and I know how much this means to you personally, and I thank you for your relentless work to push this forward. The loss of your brother and mother-in-law in the past year indeed have been a devastating blow for your family. I admire how you have channeled that pain and committed to making a difference so that we can bring hope to those with Parkinson's. I thank Chair Rogers and Ranking Member Pallone for staying with us and finding a resolution to move this meaningful bill forward. Thank you to Congressman Guthrie and Congresswoman Eshoo for your support as well. And I thank our committee staff for their hard work on bringing this together. Special thanks to Tiffany Gerasho, Una Lee, Waverly Gordon, Shayna Bevan, and Jacqueline Boland for all of your efforts. And in a special way from my personal office, Emily Silverberg, our legislative director, thank you for the resolve to continue till we pass that finish line. And thank you to Congressman Bilirakis' team, especially Chris Jones, for your hard work on this effort. I also want to thank our good friend, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton. Jennifer, we love you. Thank you. You have been there. You have faced a devastating diagnosis. And you not only joined this fight, but became one of the most vocal advocates fighting for the Parkinson's community. As many of you know, Congresswoman Wexton was first diagnosed with PSP this year, which she describes as a kind of Parkinson's on steroids. Jennifer, today and every day, you give a face to Parkinson's, and you are changing the future for those who have not yet received the diagnosis and those who will benefit from the national plan to end Parkinson's. We thank you, I thank you for your advocacy and for bravely sharing publicly about your journey. I value your friendship and am in awe of your determination and your journey. I understand that receiving a Parkinson's diagnosis has got to be truly devastating for individuals and their loved ones. It is indeed incumbent on Congress to ensure Americans know they will be supported during this frightening and life-altering time. Our legislation does just that and offers a dose of hope. This is a common-sense, compassionate bill that will establish a robust response to address Parkinson's and ensure that patients and their families receive the care that they need and deserve. By moving this forward, we will make a positive difference, improve lives, and even save lives. And for the millions of Americans living with Parkinson's, as well as their loved ones, I hope this brings much-needed hope. Hope has finally arrived, hope is on the way, and that's been the message of this whole effort. To all of my colleagues, thank you for your strong support and commitment to the Parkinson's community. I urge my colleagues to support this meaningful bill. It will make a difference, totally, to those who are impacted and to the nation. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2365, the Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate my dear friend from Florida, Representative Gus Bilirakis, for his leadership and his excellent work on this bipartisan piece of legislation. We all admire you, my friend, and we thank you for your courage. This is the first ever legislation in Congress focusing on curing and preventing Parkinson's disease and ensuring quality care for those living with the disease. More than 1 million people in the U.S. live with Parkinson's disease, and there are no treatments to cure, prevent, or significantly slow down the progression. Whether you're living with the disease or caring for someone, Parkinson's takes a terrible toll on everyone involved. This issue is also very important to me. As a pharmacist, I have, through my career, experienced this with many patients. I also watched my dear friend, Senator Johnny Isakson, courageously battle Parkinson's disease for over 6 years. Fortunately, we have an opportunity here today to pass one of the single largest congressional efforts to address Parkinson's disease. The National Plan to End Parkinson's Act will build on the great work being done at places like the Isakson Center, named after Senator Isakson, to end Parkinson's once and for all. I urge my colleagues to do what's best for patients and for the Parkinson's community by getting this bill passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes of time to the representative from California, Annette Barragan, who is an active member on our Energy and Commerce team and a very strong supporter of this legislation.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Tomko, for your leadership. I rise in support of the Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. More than 1 million people in the U.S. live with Parkinson's disease. Without a cure, this number will only continue to grow. Every 6 minutes, someone is diagnosed with Parkinson's, and their life changes forever. This diagnosis is devastating to patients and their loved ones who deal with the physical, emotional, and financial toll of this disease. I know this and its impacts firsthand. As a teenager, I watched my father battle Parkinson's for the last 10 years of his life. I also want to recognize our colleague and thank her, Jennifer Wexton, who earlier this year shared that she was diagnosed with a form of atypical Parkinsonians, PSP. And she has shared her story and has been an advocate to make sure that the bill got to where it is today. The National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, the first ever legislation solely dedicated to ending Parkinson's, is sorely needed. This bill directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to lead a national project to prevent and cure Parkinson's. Our fight against this heartbreaking disease is nowhere near done, but we have the tools to start. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and to support this bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate it. I yield 3 minutes to my very good friend, the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Falter.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. My friend from Florida, thank you. I stand before you today to express my support for the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, which addresses one of the most pressing health challenges of our time, Parkinson's disease. It's a debilitating brain disorder that disrupts our lives and the families across our nation, including those in my immediate family as well. H.R. 2365 puts forth a much-needed proactive approach, mandating Health and Human Services to formulate and regularly update a national plan coordinating efforts to not only prevent and slow the progression of Parkinson's, but to ultimately find a cure. This bill will help lift up hope for loved ones and caregivers impacted by the disease by enhancing the diagnosis, treatment, and care provided to those affected with Parkinson's. As previously mentioned, this includes supporting research for a new biomarker researchers recently discovered that can provide intelligence on the presence of an abnormal protein in the brain and body that's a known indicator of Parkinson's disease. If researchers can find these types of biomarkers in the brain and body, then doctors can better detect who has the disease or may be at high risk of developing it, and that can lead to earlier diagnosis and more effective treatment. Many people across the nation have had to deal with the emotional and financial challenges that come with taking care of a loved one stricken with this cruel disease. This legislation comes at an imperative time. According to the Parkinson's Foundation, nearly 90,000 people in the U.S. are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease every year. That's nearly a 50% increase over previous years. Today, nearly 1 million people in the U.S. are living with the dreaded disease, and that's projected to grow to 1.2 million by the end of the decade. The cost to families is devastating when it comes to medications, surgeries, and other treatments. There's nearly $52 billion per year in costs and lost income in the U.S. My friends, this is a cruel disease. My grandfather, Finley, my father, Gail, and my brother, Scott, have fallen prey to this disease. But there's hope. I urge my colleagues to join forces in passing this bill. Together, we can pave the way for the future, where Parkinson's disease is not a sentence, but a condition we have conquered through our shared dedication to the health and well-being of the American people. And this bill would not be possible without Representative Wexton. So I'll close by saying to you, my friend and colleague, there is hope. This disease may touch you physically, but it can never touch your soul. God bless. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
And we will find a cure, sir. We will find a cure. And I reserve the balance of my time. Right now. Not the balance, but I reserve.
Gentleman from Florida reserved. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield as much time as she requires to Representative Jennifer McClellan of the Commonwealth of Virginia, a great supporter of this legislation, and to do a special bit here. So thank you so much.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, to share her strong support and statement regarding this important legislation. These are her words. I rise today in strong support of the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act. As many of you know, earlier this year, I shared that I have been diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP for short, which is an atypical Parkinson's, a kind of Parkinson's on steroids. Even those of you with whom I have never interacted one-on-one have witnessed my physical deterioration from my striding confidently through the chamber earlier this year to walking more haltingly and depending on my walking sticks this summer to leaning heavily on my walker now. In all likelihood, sometime in 2024, I will come to the floor in a wheelchair. Eventually, those of us who have these diseases will be unable to walk, talk, or even feed ourselves. We will require extensive and expensive institutional or in-home care, the cost of which will likely be borne primarily by U.S. taxpayers. Since my diagnosis, I've seen firsthand how Parkinson's disease or atypical Parkinson's can change everything, not only for those of us who suffer from the disease itself, but for all of the many people in our lives who love us and want us to be well again. The physical challenges are tough. In just 2016, I ran the Marine Corps Olympic distance triathlon, and as recently as last year, got up every morning during session to go to the gym with Chair Rogers and a small group of dedicated women members. My family has felt the impacts as well. My husband Andrew and I were supposed to be getting to the good part, and we're looking forward to enjoying our empty nest as our younger son went off to join his brother in college. Instead, he will be a caregiver, and we are looking for ways to convert the first floor study and half bath to a bedroom and en-suite, so that I will be able to remain in our home when I am no longer able to make it up or down the stairs. Instead of scuba diving together in the morning and sitting under a palm tree playing Scrabble in the afternoon, we will not enjoy a leisurely retirement a decade plus from now. I know it's been difficult for my sons to watch as their vivacious, cool, for a mom, confident Congresswoman mom goes through these changes and challenges as well. This is my family story, but we unfortunately are not alone. There are over 1 million people in the United States who have these diseases and countless loved ones surrounding them. We did not expect this to happen to us, but it could happen to anyone. That is why this legislation is so critical. Today marks a historic step forward towards a world where no family has to endure what ours has. To my colleagues, friends, and those from across the country from whom I have heard an outpouring of support, I have been touched by your kindness and the desire for action from both sides of the aisle. If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that we can and must do better to fight these terrible diseases. The past year has been a difficult road and an emotional journey for me, not only facing the great health challenges that come with this diagnosis, but also coming to terms with the fact that I have to give up doing what I love. I have spent my career uplifting the stories of those in need and fighting to serve my community, and I am proud to continue that fight on behalf of the broader Parkinson's community for as long as I am able. I am grateful to have a platform to be a voice for those struggling with this disease and to fight and help bring greater resources to the search for a cure. And the National Plan to End Parkinson's Act will do just that. This is not the end of the road, but a vital and necessary first step on a journey that will lead to a cure, or even better, eradicate Parkinson's and atypical Parkinson's altogether. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation and reaffirm Congress's commitment to finding treatments and cures for millions of families across the country. Mr. Speaker, I would only add to the words of Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, she is a fighter. Having served with her in the Virginia General Assembly, I saw her fight on behalf of others and turn their pain into progress. And now I am honored to serve with her as she does that with her own pain, turns it into progress to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. And I join her in supporting this bill and asking our colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
No, I yield back, sir. Oh, I reserve. I'm sorry.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Speaker, so I'm prepared to close, but if the gentleman would like to any additional comments, he's certainly welcome to. Oh, you have one more speak. Okay. I reserve.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now recognize Representative Fletcher from the state of Texas and yield her 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Thank you.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Dr. Emmanuel Bilirakis and Honorable Jennifer Wexton National Plan to End Parkinson's Act, H.R. 2365. This bill takes a major step toward preventing and curing Parkinson's and diseases like it, diseases that impact millions of Americans, including more than 67,000 people in my home state of Texas. I'd like to thank Congressman Tonko and Congressman Bilirakis for introducing this transformative legislation, which I'm proud to co-sponsor. And I would also like to thank the Houston Area Parkinson Society for the advocacy and the important and meaningful work that they do for those living with Parkinson's in Texas's 7th Congressional District and throughout the greater Houston area. And I would like to thank my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton of Virginia, for her leadership, for her grace, and for her inspiring example. As her classmate in the Congress in the class of 2018 and fellow William & Mary Law School alum, I have admired Jennifer since the day that I met her. Today, we honor her by naming this legislation for her in recognition of the work that she has done to advance this landmark legislation that will change the lives of millions of individuals and families affected by Parkinson's and diseases like it for decades to come. But it is Jennifer who honors all of us, who honors our Constitution and our country and our fellow citizens by her service and by her example of courage and commitment and citizenship. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields.
Like to any remarks before I close? Any closing remarks?
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, I'm prepared to close if you have no other individuals that are going to be recognized.
Yeah, I'll reserve
okay.
as well.
Before I make my final statement, I have a statement from Ranking Member Pallone that I'd like to have entered
Gentleman
into
is
the record,
recognized.
please. Yeah, this has
request will be covered by general
been
leave.
a very emotional journey. And in the words of Jennifer Wexton, this could happen to anyone. So any one of us could be touched by the impact of this legislation that will deliver efforts to search for better diagnoses, sounder treatment, and ultimately find a cure. But it's also about hope. And hope reigns eternally here with this effort so that folks like Jennifer will know, and folks from Gus Bilirakis' family will know that America cares, that she cares deeply. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Florida is now recognized.
Thank you. I'm prepared to close, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, the reason the Lord brought us here today was to do good things, and that's why our constituents elect us to do good things and work together for our constituents and, of course, for our wonderful country. I want to thank Jennifer Wexton, my colleague, for really helping me with this. We could not have done this without our bipartisan support. And Jennifer, I appreciate you so very much. And I want to thank my staff and the committee staff for not giving up and really being resilient and getting this done in a timely fashion. So we urge the Senate to do the same. I want to salute also some family members, my sister-in-law, Maria, who took care of my brother, Emmanuel, for so many years. He took care of everyone in our community, really, as an old-fashioned family doctor, and called them patients every night to make sure that they were okay. He worried about us on a regular basis, the family, and never really cared about himself. God bless him for what he has done for our community, and again, for this bill. I want to thank also my nieces, Evelyn and Stella, and I want to thank my lovely, wonderful wife for taking care of my mother-in-law for so many years. This is quite an accomplishment. Again, if we couldn't do it without Representative Tonko, and again, Anna Ashew, and our ranking member Pallone, and of course, my chairman, my wonderful chairman, Kathy McMorris Rogers. So with that, Mr. Speaker, why don't we go ahead and close and get this done? I urge support, unanimous support for this wonderful bill that will do so much. And again, with Michael J. Fox's help, and he's done so much so far, we will find a cure. Thank you, and I encourage a yes vote on this particular bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2365 as amended? Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
Gentleman requests the yeas and nays. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the chair declares the House in recess subject to the call of the chair.